This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about smashing stereotypes. So I think stereotypes are actually kind of a funny thing. They tend to start because something about them is true, and sometimes that's okay. It's when they become really negative stereotypes that I think we need to do more about them. Let me give you an example first of a stereotype which is not necessarily a terrible one, and actually, in my experience, kind of true. For example, the fact that Germans, on the whole, tend to be quite punctual. Now, in my experience, this is generally extremely true. I used to teach business English in Germany, and I remember just after I'd started working there, I had a class of students who, the class began at 7:30 in the morning, and at exactly 7:30, these 12 students, all adults of various professions, would just arrive at the classroom just all at the same time at exactly 7:30 because, of course, that was when the class began. And this absolute punctuality kind of made me suspicious. I actually asked them after a few weeks if they were meeting somewhere, like around the corner first, so that they could all arrive together at exactly the right moment. But they kind of looked at me like I was crazy and just said, well, no, the class starts at 7:30, so we arrive at 7:30, which makes a lot of logical sense. But my experience teaching in other countries certainly proved that it was a rare occasion that this kind of thing happened. I also, of course, have a German husband, and when we lived in Germany, he was very particular about being punctual. In fact, it's one of the reasons that I liked him at first, because I quite like being punctual myself, and that stereotype did hold true for him. Until, unfortunately, he moved to Australia, where it's not that we're particularly late or not so punctual, but we're not exactly so precise, and he's unfortunately adopted the Australian way, and now I'm normally the one waiting at the door saying, hey, it's time to go out, aren't you ready yet? But in any case, that stereotype may not be true for every single German, but I think a lot of Germans might say that they pride themselves on being punctual. However, sometimes stereotypes, which might arise initially from something true, turn into something much more negative, or sometimes they just arise from complete ignorance and a lack of knowledge about a situation. So today our first guest is Nora Dunn, who is the professional hobo online, and she has a really interesting story to tell about an experience she had in Australia, in fact. So she's Canadian but lived in Australia for a year or so. And I'll let her tell you about the experience she had around Aboriginal Australians.
You know, I actually had an experience in Australia. I lived in Australia on and off for about a year and a half, and at one point I went up to Canberra to visit a friend of mine who was living there, and we were wandering around the parliamental grounds, and right in front of the old parliamental building, we saw this total ramshackle collection of tents and you know, there's trailers and there's obviously people are living here, but it really looks run down. And we discovered as we're there that this is the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And it actually is the world's longest standing protest. I guess it would be almost 45 years that the Aboriginals have been protesting, have been stationed in front of this building, tending to a fire that has never gone out. In order to try to get their rights. Now, I'm going to backtrack a little bit in this story to the months that I had been in Australia prior to this, whereby I had been warned that the Aboriginal people of Australia were not always nice people, that I had to be careful for my personal safety if I found myself traveling in an area that was heavy with Aboriginals, and that there were often problems with drug and alcohol addictions. And I won't say that that was wrong. That those people were wrong. I'm sure that there are problems with drug and alcohol addictions, and I'm sure there are scenarios where I would need to be a little more aware of my personal safety. But I carried this stereotype and this idea into this experience with the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And what happened that day was this woman approached my friend and I, and she was an Aboriginal woman. She was a little bit disheveled. She had these dark sunglasses on that, even though it was an overcast day, she wouldn't take off. And she had only one boot on, and the other foot was bare. And so, my first impression looking at this woman was that she fit the stereotype that I'd been given of what an Aboriginal person here would be. And so I was a little bit leery of her. I was like, I don't know. But when she invited us in, she said, would you like to learn more about our embassy and what we're standing for here? And my friend and I, with nothing better to do this day, thought, well, this could be an adventure. Sure, why not?
Good on you.
We ended up spending the entire afternoon with her. And the more I spoke with her, the more I realized that my entire judgment of this woman, based on her appearance and based on what I'd heard and stereotypes that I'd heard about the Aboriginals of Australia, was completely off base. The more she spoke, the more I realized she was not only educated, but highly educated. She was not only experienced, but she was well-traveled. And she just broke everything new thing that she said. It just broke down yet another cultural barrier that I'd put up based on my own judgments. Right down to the boot. At one point I asked her, I'm like, why do you only have one boot on? And she said, I keep one foot bare so I can maintain my connection to the earth.
Oh, wow.
And
amazing.
I just thought that was beautiful. And after this lovely afternoon with her, I realized, especially as a traveler, it's so important to keep an open mind.
Yes.
And it's also so easy for us to carry our own personal biases and the stereotypes, cultural stereotypes and otherwise, that we bring into every situation all around the world. Even at home. We all have these projections that we put out onto the world around us that sometimes prevent us from seeing the world as it really is. And it's really important to keep that open mind and to take measures really to break down those cultural barriers and stereotypes.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I find it sad that I guess other Australians gave you these kind of warnings during your trip here, and there's probably not much truth in them at all, to be honest. But it makes sense that you would then be kind of wary going into that encounter. And I'm so glad that you had such an interesting time talking to her.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And it was just a great lesson for me in travel and a bit of a slap in the face as well, really for having felt those biases, those cultural biases to begin with. But a great reminder and a lovely life lesson.
I'm so glad that Nora took the chance to get to know more by visiting the Aboriginal Tent Embassy there in Canberra. And I think it's a good lesson for all of us that it's worth informing ourselves in some way, even if we've heard stereotype stories from other people, that getting some information firsthand can be really, really useful. And it can definitely smash some of those stereotypes. Now, our next guest today is Kiliii Fish. You might remember Kiliii from episode 2 and his tale of getting lost in the forest. Now, Kiliii has some really interesting things to say about stereotypes. He's actually an indigenous Russian but grew up in the States, and he has worked with indigenous peoples across the world as a journalist and photographer and in all kinds of capacities, in fact. He has a really interesting background. So we chatted at some length about this topic, but I've got two kind of extracts from it. And his first is his own experience of being a victim of a stereotype, I guess. And I'm glad that he saw the funny side of it. And after that, we talked a little bit more about his experience with Indigenous peoples across America in general and how the stereotypes that exist are really a long way from the truth.
I work with Indigenous cultures quite a lot.
Yeah, and you do some fascinating work with Indigenous cultures.
Oh yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's very. I feel very lucky that I'm part native, and it's very helpful to me because it's much easier for me to be able to connect with indigenous communities and people because I understand them a little bit better, and of course there's a sort of inherent trust level because I'm part native and people understand. They kind of sort of feel like we're in it together,
Yeah,
which
of
is
course, you're
good.
not coming at them from any kind of exploitative angle. You're, yes, you're part of them, so that helps. Yeah.
But yeah, I think there are so many stereotypes about Native peoples, and as a person that didn't really grow up, I grew up in the modern world, and I didn't grow up on a reservation or anything like that. So I spent a good portion of my life trying to get back and trying to relearn a lot of the things, a lot of the traditional stuff, and I think people really think very much that Native peoples are either gone or that they still live in their heads. Indians, for example, all ride on horses and shoot bows and arrows and wear feather headdresses.
Yes, true.
And it's amazing. Sometimes I am absolutely stunned by the level of of this.
Yeah.
In some places, I remember running around. I was actually coming off of a primitive project, and I was wearing my buckskins and stuff. But I happened to be going scouting because I was out on a shoot,
Right.
and I was out in the desert Southwest. Can't remember where exactly. And I was running around in a national park, scouting the area, and I came back in. And I was just wearing my buckskins because that's just kind of the normal wear that I had, trying to bring that traditional stuff back into my life. And I come down onto a path, a trail that leads to the cars where a lot of people park. As I was coming down, there's this Midwestern American couple said, "Hey, Martha, you gotta get a load on this. There's an Indian."
No. Oh no. What
And
did you do or say?
I was stunned, and also I was still running, so I just flew past this.
Oh no. Oh,
A little
that's
bit.
terrible.
Yeah, it was pretty terrible, and I just thought to myself, well, hey, I might be native, part native, but I'm not a Native American for one. I'm Native Russian, so it's a very very different
Yeah.
thing. And then, I'm not quite sure what it is about
Oh
me that
no.
looks very different to people that I would be an Indian, which is really funny to me.
I'm glad you see it as funny and not too I don't know, but it's it's a scary thing to hear things like that. You wonder about people's thought processes and levels of
Oh
ignorance and
yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
I
yeah. But I mean,
suppose.
you gotta
But
take it all with a grain of salt. It's all. If it's not funny, then it's gonna be hard. It's
yeah,
hard to
oh,
live with.
so true. You have to laugh or you'll cry. So
In terms of stereotypes, I certainly deal with that all the time. Because
yeah,
because as a journalist, I have to interact with the people on all sides of the equation. So when I'm up there working on the Barrow story of a new and the whaling, I also have to talk to the people who are working as transient oil workers up there, and the people who are interested in drilling, as well as scientists and everyone else who's up there. And people, up there in the far north, it's not such a big deal. But the further south you go, and the further people are disconnected from each other in terms of just physical distance from each other. If you get onto like a Native American reservation, few outsiders get onto the reservation and see what life is like, or not just see what life is like, but actually know what life is like on there. And so the stereotypes that develop, people think of the Indians as like drunk, lazy people.
mm,
And there's something to be said about that. There's some truth in that. But the bigger picture, the deeper picture, is much more nuanced than that. And so, breaking down all these stereotypes and looking at the way that things really are, I think I think it's the same way when you travel anywhere. When you have cultures that conflict with each other, and especially when you have subcultures, it's it gets a little weird. I
yeah,
think that in places like Europe, where you walk in, if you appear in Italy. If you fly into Italy and the culture there seems very different, at least everyone's speaking a different language, and you kind of understand that you're an outsider and that this is different. But when you come to a place like Alaska, where culturally everyone is American, you kind of expect everyone to be American. You still see the same signs that like everything is written in English. There's Coca-Cola signs on the convenience stores. Yeah, you don't expect it to be weird. You don't expect the cultures you're interacting with to be so deeply, vastly different than you. And I think that's where those stereotypes become difficult and dangerous to have.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I never thought about that. And I guess our the Australian Indigenous population suffers some of those similar plight to those in America. And certainly there's a lot of stereotypes here about Australian Aboriginal people, which most people who perpetuate the stereotypes have no direct experience and are really, shouldn't be saying any of the sorts of things they're saying. And at the same time, we're still within Australia, and they're still, they can all speak English, and they're watching our, same programs on television or whatever. So there's that, both a clash and a melting together of cultures that makes it all a bit complicated, I suppose.
Yes, definitely. Certainly very complicated.
Very complicated. Yeah. I think our conclusion that stereotypes are very complicated is almost the only conclusion we can draw from discussions about stereotypes of Indigenous people. But if you're interested, do have a look at Kilii's work, because he has documented lots of really interesting stuff about Indigenous people across the world, and certainly it smashes a lot of stereotypes. Now, the other kind of area where stereotypes often come up is when we think about safety and danger. And I'm sure that many of you will have been planning a trip to somewhere in the world, and a well-meaning friend or relative has said to you, "Oh, you can't go there, it's too dangerous." And very often this is absolutely a mythical stereotype about a place. And I had a good chat to Joe Baur about this, our next guest. So Joe is from the Without a Path travel podcast and has some interesting stuff to say about both the Middle East and South America in regards to the stereotypes of how people are seen there and what we think safety considerations or a dangerous place.
Well, when I think of stereotypes, I don't necessarily, at least in terms of travel, I don't necessarily think of like basically prejudicial things or racist stereotypes, though those certainly can be dispelled through travel. I have not been to the Middle East yet. I'm going for the first time in May, but I'm excited about that because I've met a lot of people who are like, who just have these terrible images, and I'm sure very inaccurate images of what the average Middle East citizen or people from Jordan where I'm going to, someplace like Iran or whatever, they just have a very, I can't help but imagine that's an inaccurate image. I can't say without doubt because I haven't been there yet, but I just imagine that they have this very Looney Tunes image of what life is like there. So I'm excited to go there and do my best to help dispel that myth through my own work. But through personal experience, when living in Costa Rica and we had that opportunity to go to El Salvador, we definitely had a lot of people who told us not to go. And why not? Well, it's dangerous. Well, how do you know it's dangerous? Well, because of news things that we saw and just this connotation that is attached. Not saying that they don't have problems. I think recently they have been labeled the most dangerous country in the world. But it's a matter, in my experience, I mean, maybe we've just been lucky, but in my experience, it's the tourist travelers are given carte blanche to travel the country. I mean, that's what we were told. And a lot of the violence, though incredibly sad, it's usually drug related versus the police. And again, terribly sad, but it shouldn't discourage travelers. We had a perfectly fine time going there. But again, everybody was telling us, don't go. One person even told me who was married to El Salvador, but I don't believe had ever been to El Salvador, said, You're going to El Salvador? Yep. you're gonna stick out. Like you're really, really white. And to be fair, I am very white. I'm like, computer paper white. But no, I mean, I don't know where people get this idea that like people look for the gringos and are like there's a bullseye on their back. Like people were so nice there. Everybody would come up to us and they would ask us what we're doing there, but not like in a "what are you doing here" angry way. They just legitimately were curious. We don't see many people who look like you here. What are you doing here?
Yeah.
And we would explain. And then they would tell us, "Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for coming. Here's what else you should do in the country." So we had a great experience. And those are the kind of stereotypes that I like to try to encounter and then through my work dispel. I like to go to places where people think you're not supposed to go, show that there are real people living there who, and because I just find the whole idea insulting to say like, well, you shouldn't go to this country or this place. Well, why not? Well, it's too dangerous. But then there's people who live there and they love it and they're fine. Not that there aren't places in the world where you shouldn't travel or be more careful, but I just find that we have these. I think it's changing, but I think a lot of people still have this kind of Cold War image of the world where there's black and whites, and I like to do my best to try to change that a little bit.
Oh, that's great. I absolutely agree with you. And often people, I mean, those kind of people who label a country as dangerous are labeling, first of all, the whole country as dangerous. And perhaps there is a small area where it is advised not to go, but it's very rare that there's an entire country that's classified as too dangerous for a tourist to visit. And you're also right that, often it's, yes, sadly dangerous to, particular groups in the country, but not to tourists. And there's just so much more to it than that simple kind of, don't go there, it's dangerous label. So it's great that you are actively working to dispel some of those myths, I think.
Sure. Yeah, and it really cracks me up when U.S. Americans say that about some place. Whether I haven't been to Colombia, I've just traveled through on layovers, but I've heard get it for Colombia, some Central American countries, like just don't go there. And I find it hilarious, or just kind of blissfully ignorant when U.S. Americans make those kind of broad statements. Because I've actually, on the other side of the coin, I've spoken to Latinos in South America and Central America who won't go to the States because of the news we get, and they say, "Oh, it just looks too dangerous. Like I'm not going there." I was just actually doing language. I was doing language practice with somebody from Venezuela, and she was saying that she wants to go to Canada or England, the UK, to practice her English, and I just said, "Oh, why not the States? Oh, it looks too dangerous." and not that she's not right, that there are certainly some areas where there's places that I've been that people thought, no, that's too dangerous, that I'd rather be than some places in the state. But I just thought it's funny that she was able, I mean, we're also a huge country of 330 million people and that even area. She was able to paint the whole country as too dangerous.
I find it really refreshing to hear that Joe's met South Americans who've heard that the United States is so dangerous they won't go there. It's almost good to hear that stereotypes go both ways, but I guess it's even better to hear from people like Joe who are actively trying to challenge stereotypes and spread the word about these kind of false generalizations. Stereotypes are a tricky issue, and there will be more discussion of them in future episodes of this podcast, I am sure. So thank you very much for listening to episode 4 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Of course, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my lovely guests today. Firstly, we had Nora Dunn of theprofessionalhobo.com. Nora's been blogging for many, many years, and we knew each other online for a long time before she popped across from Eastern Australia on the Indian Pacific and spent a night with me in Perth a few years back. I'll look up that old blog post that she wrote about that and put that in the show notes too. Nora does all kinds of things. She's currently based in Peru. She has a book out from last year called Working on the Road, The Unconventional Guide to Full-Time Freedom. So if that's your aspiration, have a look at workingroad.com. And she also has a monthly Dear Nora column on Credit Walk. There'll be a link in the show notes, which is interesting stuff for travellers. Kiliii Fish joined us again, and I really urge you to have a look at his amazing photography. You can find him at kiliii.com, and that's Killii. You know I love his 3 eyes. And on Instagram, he's at Kiliii Fish, so KILIIFISH. And finally, I also spoke today with Joe Baur of the Without a Path travel podcast. He's been a travel guidebook author for many years, but this year he's also releasing Talking Tico, which is his travelogue on living in Costa Rica and travelling around Central America for 10 months. So these details and more will be in the show notes, and for this episode they'll be at notaballerina.com/04. I also want to say a huge thanks for all the lovely feedback I've had since I launched the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and a very particular thanks to the loveliest listeners of all who've left very kind ratings and reviews of the show on iTunes already. As always, you can reach me on Twitter at Amanda Kendall using the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod. You can also leave feedback on Facebook by looking up Not a Ballerina, and if you have a spare moment and have been enjoying listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast, I would super love to have some more ratings and reviews over on iTunes. That helps spread the joy to more travel lovers. Thank you so much. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM.
For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, Podcast.